Hey Nidal, we get a lot of people asking questions about should they buy new, should they buy old? What kind of advice can you give them?
Great question. And it's very important to realize that there is no one size fits all when it comes to property investing. What I mean by that is depending on your position and your situation and your goals, that's going to dictate what type of property you buy. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you've got a low income um, and you have a limited borrowing capacity. That's going to shape what you can and cannot do. So if you are a low income earner, then it's going to make more sense for you to buy something that's going to be positive cash flow, which can sustain itself. Whereas if you're a higher income earner, then that strategy could be a little bit different. You may have the ability to negatively gear yourself or be able to lose a little bit of money along the way. But that strategy is going to differ completely from someone who's on a low income.
Okay. And look, since you brought up the low income, how would you recommend the approach for someone who's a low income earner compared to those who are higher income earners?
Yeah. So with low income owners, we always focus on a higher yielding property. And the reason for that is because we want the maximum cash flow coming in to help support the portfolio. So to pay all the bills and all the expenses and everything, and in some cases, leave a little bit behind for the investors as positive cash flow. Whereas with a higher income earner, generally they're going to have higher tax implications. So when we come to recommend property, we're looking for properties that are tax effective while still being profitable in terms of bringing enough money to sustain themselves, but also understanding that the real value is going to be in the capital growth that we get on the back end. So one of the things to consider when buying a property, especially when you're looking at the difference between new or old, it's going to tie into the end strategy. So if you're looking for something that's going to be a little bit low maintenance and a little bit hands off, then a newer property can sometimes be more suitable because there's less maintenance issues. We've got a higher selection of tenancies up front. And because it's brand new, then generally there's less headaches at the very beginning. So for the first 5 years, a brand new property wins over an older one when it comes to low maintenance and less moving parts and less hassles. Whereas an older property, on the other hand, has different benefits to it because, and with an older property, you can manufacture equity, which means you can either do a renovation or a subdivision or an extension or something to manufacture growth in the value of that property. So the two properties have different benefits and features to them, but which one is right or wrong? There is no right or wrong way because there is lots of ways to be right when it comes to investing.
So obviously you work between different kind of property types, between townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about those and how they would apply to different people?
Absolutely. When it comes to property, there is different types of properties that are available for different budget types and different strategies. So depending on where you're buying, will sometimes dictate what type of property you should be purchasing or building. So for example, if you're building out in the suburbs where it's very community driven, family driven, lots of schools, parks, shops, things like that, generally speaking, they're family friendly areas. So you would have a detached house with either a 3 or a 4 bedroom home on its own title, on its own land, etc. Because that's going to be the most suitable product type. Whereas if you're building or trying to invest closer to like a central business district, a CBD or a city, generally speaking, it's going to be more medium to higher density types of projects that you would find and invest in. Now, which one is better? There's no right or wrong way because depending on the budget, depending on the strategy, and depending on the capacity to be able to invest is going to determine. So let's say you have a limited budget of $500,000 and you can't find a house that's going to be suitable, then you might be looking at either a townhouse or an apartment, which can help you achieve that same goal of getting into the property market, building some equity, building some capital and cash flow, and then being able to go again. So I guess if we were to break down the different property types, the smallest and cheapest that we normally have available is apartments. And generally because that's going to be a higher density project where you have multiple units or apartments being built on the same in the same complex on the same block of land, which generally comes at a lower price point than something that's independent on its own. The next one up is going to be a townhouse. And this is where you will have a series of dwellings built side by side, which will generally share common walls and maybe share a driveway and some underground services like plumbing and things like that and sewage. The difference between an apartment and a townhouse is generally going to be the either like the body corporate or the shared community services. So with an apartment, generally speaking, it's going to be a strata title, which means that there's a group that votes on every decision that's made throughout I guess, the maintenance period. The next one up is going to be the body corporate. So generally, if you're buying in a group of townhouses and they share a driveway and some underground services, there's a body corporate that's engaged to maintain all the services that, that's used by the particular property. And it's not where every owner has to come together to make a decision, because there's a body corporate, which is kind of like a property manager that oversees all the maintenance and things that come up with the property. The next one up is when we go to a Torrance titled detached house. And this is when you've got a normal 3 or 4 bedroom home, couple of bathrooms, single or double garage, own detached on its own independent block. And that's obviously going to have a big market for it. The next one up from that, which is something that we utilize as an investment product, is when you have dual keys or duplexes. And that's when you've got multiple residences or multiple dwellings under the same roof. So for example, with a dual key, from the streetscape, it looks like a normal house. It's just got the same garage, room, door, etc. But generally there will be 2 houses under that roof, because they'll have a side entrance and then one from the front. And the way the houses are designed is you might have 3 bedroom, 2 bathrooms on one side, and on the other side you'll have, say, a 1 or a 2 bedroom with 1 bathroom. And because you've got multiple dwellings, what it means is that the person can live in one side and rent out the other, or they can live in one side and have family or older children living in the other side, or they use it completely as an investment product and have 2 rental incomes coming from the one property. Now, with a dual key, ultimately it always stays on one title, which means that you've got the 2 dwellings, you can get the 2 rental incomes, but when it's sold, it has to be sold as one property, which can sometimes limit the pool of buyers, because then it's going to be appealing more to either an investor or someone who's looking specifically for a multi-dwelling property, but it's going to be sold on one. Whereas when you go to that next step of going to a duplex, that's when you've got 2 dwellings, and they could be 2 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, single garage each one. They both could be identical and both built on the same title to begin with, on one block of land to start. But then after they're built, they can actually be strata titled. So you can split the titles and be able to sell one off to pay down the other side, or sell both off and go do it again, or maintain both of them and keep them both as rentals. So the duplex option gives you that flexibility of being able to, I guess, do development, but after the property is built, so to speak. So rather than get the subdivision approval at the start and then build them, you build them first and then you split them at the end. So that's just one strategy. And then something that's come up over the last few years has been co-living. So this is a new product that's hit the market in response to a growing demand and a growing problem that we see out there in society, because we have a big problem with lone households, meaning that there's one person living in a house that's got 3 bedrooms and they're only using 1 room and the other 2 are unused. And we've got a housing issue and a housing supply problem in this country, where instead of that person having to rent the whole house just to use 1 room and end up having to pay more rent and more bills, and in many cases they end up subleasing anyway. What we have been involved in the last few years is the co-living product, where houses are being built as a dedicated co-living space, meaning that it would be let's say a 3 bedroom, but it'll have 3 bathrooms. So each bedroom will have its own ensuite or independent bathroom. They'll have lockable pantries and split system air cons, a little retreat area. They will have separate utilities and things charged to them individually. So what we're creating is I guess a product that's accommodating for those people who might not necessarily want to rent a whole house out by themselves because they can't afford it anymore. And also it's accommodating to those people who are prepared to live in shared housing, but they don't want to live with the owner of the house or the person who's mainly responsible, because they end up feeling like a second class tenant in there. So the co-living product has been quite successful in the sense that it's creating a solution to a problem that we've got out there. And along the way, we're actually finding that people are enjoying living with others and they're creating little micro communities, and they have been quite successful. So these are the different product types that we work across. Obviously, we do a lot more, but this is the main I guess, new build suite that we cater to our clients. But ultimately, there is no right or wrong way when it comes to investing. The main thing is to get into the market as soon as possible, because the sooner you get in, the sooner you're going to start building some equity and generating some wealth.
There's been a common thing that's popped up not too long ago, since COVID times, people rent vesting. Now, I'm sure you have a take on that as well, but what would you recommend for people doing rent vesting, since the co-living situation is such a predominant thing in the industry? Would you recommend people kind of rent vest with a co-living situation and get a rental, or is that?
It's a great question, because over the years, we've been able to help first home buyers get into some of these investor products. And one particular case that comes to mind is a client of mine in New South Wales, where he bought a dual key property as a first home buyer. He lived in the small side, in the 2-bedroom side, and he rented out the 3-bedroom side to help him offset his mortgage payments. So even though he still qualified for the first home buyer's grant because he was living there, he was also able to rent out the other side, which then helped him pay down his mortgage. And obviously, with the way the market has grown, he was able to get some good amount of equity to then be able to go and invest again. So it is a great strategy that we've seen happen across different buyer types. In terms of first home buyers buying a co-living, that's also a great idea, because as a first home buyer, you are allowed to rent out the rooms. You just have to be living in the property. So as long as you're living in the property, there's nothing to say that you can't rent out a couple of rooms just to help with reducing the mortgage payments and being able to put you in a financial position to look or consider investing again.
How often would you say someone should be getting into the market and buying another property and continuing their property portfolio?
Again, there's no one way to measure that, because every person's circumstance is going to be a little bit different. Normally, we advise not to be rushed. So we generally work on 12 to 18 months between property purchase. So if your property finishes getting constructed today, that means within 12 to 18 months after that, we're going to be looking for the next one, because that gives you enough time to build up a little bit of equity, as well as get comfortable with the cash flow in and cash flow out, and have some predictability and some certainty around your portfolio before you go out there and stretch yourself even further.
Okay, so it's all about building that strong foundation first and really establishing yourself in the industry, using the equity, the capital growth to really boost yourself into that next one, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely, because building a property portfolio is like building a business. If you're not looking at the cash flow, you can get in trouble very quickly.
Being part of this industry for 16 odd years, you would obviously have connections through the industry. Now, how does that help first home buyers or people new into the industry that don't really have anyone to look to, or don't know where to go from getting their finance approved, or getting their conveyancing and all that kind of building and plans? Because obviously it's a stressful process for them. So how would you kind of approach that, or help people kind of approach that scenario?
Building a home is a very challenging but rewarding process. There are many steps and hurdles to overcome throughout the process, but if you persist, it all pays off in the end. When it comes to the flow from the time you come up with the idea of purchasing a property to the time you collect the keys and you move in, there are a few things to be considerate of. First of all is having the right team around you. So making sure that you've got a good finance broker, someone who is able to give you confidence when you go out there and start putting offers or trying to purchase a property, because the finance broker is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you in terms of not just with the finance, but also with the settlement of the property, because there's going to be a lot of conditions that you may not know exist yet, but your finance broker will guide you through those. The second part is to make sure that you've got a good, whether you're working with an agent or a buyer's advocate or a professional that's helping you through this transaction, you want to be able to rely on them to do the legwork, but you make the final call. Never take the responsibility away from you being able to make the final decision, but you also have to be able to trust on the team that you have engaged. The next part of the team, or the next person in your team you want to have, is a good conveyancer or a solicitor, because someone who's going to read over all the paperwork that you're about to sign off on. And particularly with things like conditions in the contract, so whether the contracts are going to have conditions that support your situation, like whether you need it subject to finance, subject to sale, subject to whatever it is that you're working through. The other thing is to look at whether there's any extra costs involved that may not appear inside the contracts that you're signing off, especially if you're buying a new build product. If you're looking at building a brand new house and land package and you were just to jump online onto realestate.com or just on the builder's website, in many cases, they're going to give you the base price of that home to be built. And the base price doesn't always include a finished or a turnkey product, meaning that there are going to be things left out of that build which you will have to take care of after you receive possession. Things in like some of the things that may be left out are things like landscaping, driveways, pathways, fencing, TV antennas, letterboxes, clotheslines, window furniture. There's a lot of things that tend to add up, and when you think about it, it could be a very big cost. So when you are working with an agency or someone who's going to offer you a fixed price and a turnkey product, generally speaking, that product is a complete product. You can get the key from the builder and you give it straight to a tenant if you are renting it out. You have to understand, yes, you are going to be paying obviously for that service and for those extra inclusions in there. So you will be paying a retail price. However, when you calculate the time it takes you to have to do all these individual jobs after the property has been handed over, it actually works out better in the long run just to get someone to do it, bite the bullet, and start making money sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced, every property owner has probably experienced the situation where they've just said, probably should have got a property manager or something to handle it for me, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the property manager is a good one because if you engage them early on as well, they can help you do some of the heavy lifting too. So in our team, for example, when we're dealing with new builds and they're coming up to practical completion, even though the property is not ready to be handed over to the owner or to be tenanted just yet, our property managers are in there with the building inspector going through, looking for any defects, looking for anything that we need rectified, because generally speaking, when we get the possession or the keys from the builder at handover, we've got 3 months to make sure that we pick up on any defects that we can to make sure that they're rectified within that 3-month maintenance period that the builders give us. So we want to make sure and we want to find as many faults and defects as possible in the first 90 days.
In South Australia, we have a massive market and we've seen massive growths, double-digit capital growths in suburbs in the north. Now, when you go to the north, there's probably 100 suburbs that people have never heard of. Which ones would you say are the best pockets to get into right now?
Okay, I'm going to come back to you on the certain pockets, and I want you to chime in and give me some of your suggestions as well. However, what I can tell you about the South Australian property market as a whole is that we are severely undersupplied at the moment. When you consider the amount of people that we have moving into our country and into our state versus the amount of properties that are getting completed or being built to accommodate for that, there's a massive undersupply at the moment. So that's putting pressure on our housing market across the board. So what that means is that the market is going to grow organically just based on what people are prepared to pay for property. And we see that price etching higher and higher month on month. Now, when you start looking at particular suburbs, South Australia is driven by affordability. So I'm going to pass that question back to you because I want to know, what areas have you been getting requested from your clients? Because you are a consultant at Silvertail. You're dealing with clients who are calling in wanting investment opportunities. They're asking us for advice on, which area should we buy into? And we're having the same conversation that we're having now. What's your borrowing capacity? How much can you do? What's your strategy? What's your goal, etc. By the time you arrive at that point where you're ready to make a recommendation to someone who is in that position, what areas are you suggesting?
Well, we get a range of clients, right? So we get people on the lower end of 600 and people all the way up to 1.2, 1.5. Now, people that are investors and focusing purely on investment, we're always recommending the north because the north has been such a massive pocket of space. There's been massive growth in the north and we've experienced great results. So we're talking about Elizabeth, Davern Park, we're talking about Munapara, Virginia, all those kind of areas, even Evanston Gardens. So we're seeing massive spikes in those areas. And not just that, they're being maintained every year in, year out. They're continuing to grow at the same rate. And I think, look, just based off the data, last financial year, we've seen Elizabeth number one. 5 years ago, you talk to any South Aussie, they're going to tell you, Elizabeth, come on. You know what I mean? But we're seeing massive growth in those areas, as well as Davern Park. And look, not being number one, number three ranked in South Australia out of all the thousands of suburbs, it's a crazy feat on its own. But to continue that same trajectory forward, it's great as well. So when you look at capital growth, rental yield, you're looking for tax depreciation. New properties in those suburbs are really ideal because they hit all three. And with established property, as you mentioned before, established property, you're getting a lot of issues that come up with maintenance. Yes, you're getting a bit more land potentially, but you're getting an older property that's not going to rent for as much. Whereas a newer property will always rent for the top of the market. And, you obviously work in the property management and investment space as well. So I'm sure you've seen the great results that have been happening with property managers, managing properties in that area and getting properties on market for a week, sometimes less than a week. So it really does come down to savings and maximizing the return for our investors and our clients.
Okay. So if you're a first home buyer and you had a $650,000 budget and you're looking for a house and land package and you had the option of, let's say, Elizabeth, Manapara and Davern Park, where are you buying?
I'm going Davern Park any day of the week.
Really?
Yeah.
Why Davern Park?
Davern Park because it's had such a, it's almost like right now, it hasn't fully hit everyone that this is going to be a massive area. But what's happening if you're on the ground every day, like I am, having chat with clients, going to sites, you're seeing new properties being erected every single day there. And it's just become one of the hotspots in the north. It's reasonably close to transportation. It's got parks, it's got recreational schools as well. And there's massive uplift that's been going there. And I've noticed even interstate investors who actually know more than South Australian investors because they've seen these changes happen in areas like Dandenong in Victoria and New South Wales. They see all these areas just that were low income, but now good luck getting one for $1 million. You know what I mean? So, and I think that's going to be Davern Park in a couple of years. I really think that's going to be the next $1 million suburb in the north.
I look forward to revisiting this podcast conversation in a few years' time, and we'll discuss this more.
100%.
Because look, I can't disagree with you that Davern Park has seen massive gentrification right across the board. I've seen schools being turned into suburbs, into little communities. We're actually getting some really high rents in Davern Park as well. There are some pockets in the new developments where we've done co-living, and we're getting close to $900 a week on a 3 or 4 bedroom home.
Exactly right.
So yes, I can agree with you that Davern Park has been obviously punching above its weight, particularly because it had a bad rap from local South Aussies over the years. However, I want to, I guess we can even put a bet on this off the camera, but I'm going to go Elizabeth over Davern Park, and I'll tell you why. Elizabeth has a lot going for it in terms of existing infrastructure. There's a train station, there's a hospital, there's good schools, there's shops, there's Elizabeth Shopping Centre as well as Manapara. So obviously they're still accessible by Davern Park, but I'm just talking in terms of existing infrastructure as well as location. It's just that a little bit closer into the Adelaide CBD. And what I see happening in Elizabeth, especially in pockets like Elizabeth Vale, has been mind-blowing. So a couple of months ago, I was inquiring about some properties in Elizabeth Vale near the hospital, and I was surprised to find that there was a whole block there where every property had sold over $980,000 or $950,000, even some hitting $1 million. And these are just normal properties. These are just normal 3-bedroom homes on 600-700 square meter blocks of land that were built in probably in the 60s or 50s even. But the reason for the growth is because that particular portion there, or that part, had been rezoned because it was so close to the hospital that now it's opened it up to, medical facilities and I guess medical practices to come and set up in there, and especially NDIS groups. So because of what we've seen happen in that pocket there, I got excited about Elizabeth. And mind you, 10, 15 years ago, people used to sort of, look down on if you're buying a property in Elizabeth. Yep. Whereas now I think it is probably one of our best areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm not surprised you said Elizabeth, to be fair. It is number 1 right now, so it's completely understandable. And honestly, I think it might hold that number 1 spot the year to come. Just because I've been in Elizabeth as well and I've seen massive growth. I think Davern Park just hits a bit closer for me because I do have that, I have a lot of clients that are directly going to Davern Park. So for their best interest, I want it to be number 1. I think we might be contending you on that spot. But let's talk about the South, because the South has also seen massive growth and gentrification that's been going on, especially down that southern corridor in, we're talking Ranella, we're talking the Seaford kind of area, and those surrounding suburbs. They've really just all kind of brought each other up, and they become, I guess, for a lot of people, unaffordable to get into. But there's still a few pockets that are quite affordable at the moment and that are showing great capital growth. What's your kind of take on that?
Well, look, Adelaide can grow in one of two directions, either north or south. And
Mm.
we've seen what's happened with the north, and now the south is also pegged for some good growth up ahead. And it's always been a good performer. Uh, I saw firsthand what happened to Seaford when they first extended the train line. I think it was back in 2012. I was new in the industry. I'd only been a couple of years in, but the amount of new construction, new builds, and the people starting to move to Seaford that never would have considered it in the past was mind blowing. And then we've started to see it in further areas. And now we're in Aldinga, and we're breaking ground in places that we would have thought this would never really be sold as a house and land package because this was, so far away, or, people didn't really comprehend that Aldinga or Seaford or some of these suburbs that were further out could be this developed. But you just drive down there and you'll see construction sites left, right, and center. And it's a really good, it's really good feedback for us, knowing that, the areas that we've been promoting and recommending are actually being driven by the whole market, not just us.
No, absolutely. 100%. It's a different type of feeling, right? When you've been right, and you've kind of been working alongside clients and getting them into that market, and they got in at the perfect time, just before everyone else started kind of seeing what it really is, the gem of the South or the gem of the North, they call it.
Look, I just want to interject on that one point, because there's never a perfect time. I've seen so many people over the years come in and, they're trying to time the market, and they're trying to work out the best time to be jumping in, and they're waiting for the market to crash or waiting for things to happen. And my advice has always been the same, is don't wait for the market, enter into the market and then wait. So it doesn't matter at what point you get in. The end goal is, in 10 years time, when you look back, you're not going to worry whether you got in March or whether you got in September, or whether, waited for a dip or anything like that. Just get in. Now, at the start, it's not going to feel very comfortable, because especially if it's your first property, you're going to be out of your comfort zone, and it's not going to feel like, it's very comfortable for you. So some people might think, oh, it's not the right time, or wasn't meant to be, or whatever, and they try and justify not actually putting a little bit of pressure on themselves. But the reality is, when you're buying a property, it's never going to be the right time. The trick is just accept, embrace that it's going to be a challenging period for a couple of months while you're going through the transaction. And then obviously remember that long term, the goal is that you pay the price now and you'll reap the reward later.
A lot of people, when they buy a property, they hit a lot of, I guess, snags or hurdles along the way. What do you recommend for people to do to approach those kind of situations, and what kind of situations do you think usually occur?
It's important to understand that challenges and problems and complications is part of life, and it doesn't discriminate against you buying property. So sometimes when you're buying a property, you're going to come across certain challenges, issues, etc. It's really important to, number one, pause. Secondly, pinpoint the right problem. Thirdly, bring in the right professional. And then fourth, push forward. So what I mean by that is, sometimes when you're going through a big purchase and emotions can be a little bit high, we have a saying, when emotions are high, logic is low. So sometimes people get highly emotional that, either the finance didn't get approved, or the property, they were issued a variation, or there was some kind of price blowout, or some issue had happened. In that particular moment, it's very easy to just blow up and, throw everything out the window and go, it's all too hard. And I've seen people do this over the years. What I recommend is, first, pause, meaning just stop, cut out all the noise, and just focus in on pinpointing what is the main problem. Is it finance? Is it to do with the build? Is it to do with the council? Is it to do with insurance? Find out specifically what part of the process is broken. Once you've identified what needs fixing, then you got to bring in the right professional. So if you've got a finance problem, there's no point bringing in your real estate agent. If you've got a building problem, there's no point getting your broker. So you got to understand bringing in the right professional for the right cause. And then finally is being able to push forward. So once you come up with a strategy to tackle whatever issue it is, then it's about committing and being able to push forward despite not feeling like it. Because a lot of people don't feel like pushing through the hard stuff. And that's the point where everyone drops off. But if you can be one of those people that persists and pushes through that final 10, 20%, that's where the magic is made.
How would you recommend, I guess, for someone who's going into home and land packages compared to just buying an established property in that kind of regard with issues arising and whatnot?
Yeah, look, great question. Because as a first home buyer, you have to understand you have a lot of incentives sometimes to purchase a brand new property as opposed to buying something that's older and established. So the main benefits of buying a house and land package versus an established is that you're going to have a lower cash requirement up front because you're receiving the first homeowner's grant and no stamp duty. So if we were to put that, roll that out as an example on a $600,000 property. If that property was established, straight off the bat, you need a minimum of 5% for your deposit. So that's going to be 30 grand. You need another 5% on your stamp duty. So there's roughly another 30 grand. And then you're going to have to pay some LMI, lender's mortgage insurance. So if you're borrowing more than 80% of the value of the property, the bank will take out insurance to cover themselves, but they'll make you pay it as the buyer. So when you add all those costs up, you could be up for about, 75, 80K just to purchase a $600,000 property if it was established. Whereas that $600,000 property was brand new, and let's say it was a house and land package where the land's worth 300 and the build's worth 300, then straight off the bat, you would, in a normal situation, you would pay stamp duty only on the land portion on that 300K, which would work out to be about 15K. But because of the current grants that we've got as of August 2025, there is no stamp duty on them. So straight away, you're saving that 30K that you would normally pay on an established property. And the other thing is you're getting $15,000 coming to you from the government. So straight off the bat, you're about $45,000 better off just for buying a brand new property as opposed to an older property as a first home buyer.
That's a massive difference. 45,000 on a $600,000 property difference. It's unbelievable, right? Because that's some people's annual income.
So, again, and one other thing to add to that is that there's also the LMI waiver if you qualify for, again, some of these other government schemes that are available. So it's important to understand that these government incentives come and go. So what's available right now might not be available by the time you might be watching this video. But as a first home buyer, just understand that there are more incentives to build something brand new as opposed to buying something that's established.
Well, when it comes to kind of getting these government schemes, how would you approach that when it comes to the financing and getting these government incentives and whatnot?
Great question. I would suggest finding a broker who is across all the first homeowners grants and the incentives available to first home buyers. Because even in this day, I come across brokers who don't understand some of the incentives that are available, and they end up giving, the wrong advice to first home buyers, which makes it seem like it's harder than what it actually is. So first things first is find a broker who's competent and across the first home buyer space, meaning they understand the grants, the incentives, and how they all tie in together, because different lenders have different ways of how they treat these grants. And what I mean by that, some lenders want you to have all the money at the beginning, and then after you get on site, then they pay you the $15,000 first homeowners grant after the slab has been poured in the ground. Whereas some lenders will actually advance that because they know it's coming at a later date. So they'll include it as part of your funding position so you don't have to pay it at the beginning. So again, having the broker is going to be critical in terms of knowing which way to move. Now, in terms of the options that are available, because of the push towards trying to get first home buyers into the market, there are government funders out there like Homestart, which offer very low deposit options for first home buyers, as little as 2% in some cases. And they give you good borrowing capacity to be able to get you into the market, not as a long-term funding option, but something as a short-term, just to get you in. And then once you've got a little bit of equity, you're able to refinance out, then you can go to a more traditional lender. So these are some of the, I guess, low deposit options that are available out there. There are several lenders. I'm not recommending Homestart. I'm not recommending any lending product. This is just from my experience in the market and dealing with different lenders. This is what's out there. So there are low deposit options for first home buyers. There is also the option of being able to use a family home as a guarantee. So if mum and dad have owned their home for a while, they've got plenty of equity in it, they may have even paid it off, and they're happy to help you get into the market by using a portion of their equity as security. What the bank's able to do is take security over mum and dad's property, help you purchase your property, and then when your property has grown in value and it's at 80% LVR, then you can take it and refinance it elsewhere. So essentially helping you get into the market without having to come up with all the funds all in one hit.
And this might be a bit of a big one. A lot of finances involved in it. SMSF. Talk to me about that. Is that what's going on with SMSF in South Australia right now?
Great question. And whilst I don't want to get into specific financial advice and give advice around self-managed super fund, in the simplest form, it's basically taking the money that you have from your existing superannuation fund. So if you're an employee and your employer is paying you, superannuation into one of the funds that you've chosen at the beginning, basically what you're doing is you are taking those funds and transferring them over to your own superannuation, which will be a self-managed superannuation fund. And the idea behind setting up your own self-managed super fund is that you control your own investing. Because at the moment, you've got money in your super, there is someone who is employed by that superannuation company called a fund manager to direct how your money is invested. So they will direct it into international shares, Australian shares, into some property, into some other investment vehicles. And at the end of the financial year, they'll obviously look at what's been made. They'll report it to you. And, generally you'll be working on, say, 9-10% growth or whatever it is per year, whilst being in your super fund. It can vary. Again, I'm not quoting any figures. However, the idea behind setting up your own self-managed super fund is that you roll over those funds from whoever your provider is into your own account. Now, there are requirements and you have to have enough money to make this worthwhile and feasible, because there are high costs involved with setting it up and the maintenance and the auditing and the ongoing running of the SMSF. So assuming that you qualify and it's suitable for you to set up, what you would do is you'd roll over your funds and you would use those funds to leverage against, which means you can borrow against those funds to go buy a property directly and put it inside your superannuation. So the way it would look like is, let's say you had about $200,000 in your superannuation, or between you and your partner, you had $100,000 each. As long as you've got over 150, 200, you can justify the costs of setting it up and maintaining it. So you'd set up a self-managed super fund. From there, what you would do is you would use that $200,000 to serve as your 20% deposit plus your costs. So assuming you're buying a $600,000 property, your 20% of that is going to be $120K, plus you've got to have your stamp duty and your other costs. So let's add another 5-6% onto that, another 30. So you're at $150K. Plus the banks will generally want to have a little bit of a buffer amount as well. So just to make sure you don't run completely dry. But basically that should be enough to help you borrow 80% of a $600,000 property. Now, if you purchase that property and you let it sit in your account and that property is growing at, say, I don't know, between 5 and 10% per year, you're actually making 5 to 10% on 600,000 because you've been able to leverage. And let's say that the property is growing by 50 or 60K. How much did you need to have in your account to be able to produce that same 50 or 60K?
Comes a comparison, right?
Correct. Because you're able to leverage. So the power in property is when you're able to leverage, when you're able to turn $1 into 10.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty about leveraging and being able to get a higher return. Because if I bought a property for $1 million and I made a 5% return, that's $50,000 a return. Now, let's say I bought that property and I only needed to use 10% of my money, 10% of the value, right? And I only put in 100 grand, right, to buy that property, but it's made me 50. I've made a 50% return on cash.
Yeah.
That's the power of property.
Let's talk about another big one though, commercial.
Mm-hmm.
Commercial is, I get the request all the time. Someone's bought 2 or 3 residentials and now they're looking at commercial. What kind of advice or information do you think is applicable for someone getting into commercial, and what do they need to look out for? What do they need to be wary of, and what kind of returns are they expecting compared to residential?
Yeah, I guess to pre-frame my response is that we focus on residential property. So that's where we're experts in. However, I've done my own commercial investing and helped several clients on purchasing and selling and buying and doing their own strategies. What I find the biggest difference between residential and commercial is really going to come down to the maintenance of the costs involved. Because as a residential property, you as the owner are responsible for your council rates, your insurances, your emergency services levies, your insurances, all the running costs of the property. So if there's any maintenance issue, that's on you as a landlord if it's something to do with the property. Whereas when in a commercial nature, all of those costs are actually passed on to the tenant, because the tenant pays everything from the outgoings, insurances, the maintenance, even the gardening, even anything to do with the property, that becomes the cost of the tenant. With a residential property, the nature of those leases are normally 12 months, Whereas when you go into a commercial nature, it's usually 3 years plus. So 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, etc. The so these are the benefits between a commercial over residential. The I guess the downside or the things to be considerate of is that commercial properties can sometimes go vacant for a lot longer than a residential property will. So whilst a residential property might remain vacant for 1 or 2 weeks, 3 weeks tops, a commercial property can go for months and months being vacant. So the I guess the risk of being able to having to cash flow this property while hanging on to it could be a bit higher whilst it's vacant. Obviously, once you get a lease, then it becomes a different story. The other part to it is when it comes to financing these properties. So with a residential property, you can get the deal done with as little as 5% deposit if you're a owner occupier, or 10% if you're an investor. Whereas with a commercial property, the minimum you're going to need is about 30% deposit. So then the barrier for entry is a lot higher for commercial than it is for residential. So which one is right or wrong? Again, there's no right or wrong answer. And I know people get sick of me saying that, but it really does depend on what is it that you are trying to achieve. What's your capacity? What's your risk tolerance? What can you and can't you do before you go out there and make these decisions? And
Now, let's say someone comes to you and asks you a simple question. I'm new in the industry. I have my own property. I owe maybe 40% left on it. What do you recommend for someone that's looking to kind of expand their horizons, but they're just coming in without knowing much? They have an old school kind of way of thinking, I guess.
Yeah. Again, so one of the first steps that we like to delve into is doing a fact find on who we're working with, because there's no point giving a bit of random advice without knowing what we're working with and what we're trying to achieve. So first things first, I want to know, how old are these clients? Are they in their 30s, 40s, 50s? Do they still have dependents at home? How many years have they got before they're finished? What is their goal? Is it to, be completely debt free and have some investment funds coming in? Is it to continually do projects and, make it as a full-time business and sort of quit their work and focus on this? I find people have different goals and different reasons for why they come to invest in property or buy property in the first place. So for us is to identify, what is it that we're trying to achieve and where are we starting at? Once we've got those two key bits of information, the next part is to go, okay, what is our capacity? Right? So what can we borrow? How much can we borrow? What sort of deals can we do? Because if we can, if we can borrow, let's say 1, 2, 3 million, that's going to give us a lot more opportunities and options than if we've got a budget of 700,000. So it's going to, it's going to influence the advice that we give. The other thing is the risk tolerance, because some people aren't made to be able to take that kind of risk on, because again, when emotions are high, logic is low, and they end up doing things to jeopardize their own financial progress. And I've seen this firsthand, year in, year out, where people will make decisions that are against their financial goals, and there is no justification for it, but it's done because emotions were high, logic is low.
Yes, look, you've been in the industry for quite a while, and you've seen obviously the west and the east both flourish and now become unattainable to many people unless you go really far east, kind of up in Mount Barker region, or you're kind of going west. But there's only one suburb west that I can think of right now that's had massive growth and is still, I guess, potentially attainable for people trying to get into the west. You familiar with what area I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, well, obviously we're talking about Taparoo here. Now a lot of people have kind of come to me and asked me specifically for Taparoo. And before, I live in Lockley, so I live in the western suburbs in the heart of the west, and I haven't even heard of that suburb until 2-3 years ago. And now I'm seeing massive growth there. People coming interstate, buying properties up like they're candy. Do you think that's going to be something that's feasible in the next couple of years, or do you think it's going to be kind of closed off just like every other western suburb has been?
There's a saying in property that you should buy the worst house on the best street. And when it comes to suburbs and it comes to locations, what we like to do is look at what are these best streets. So in terms of coastal locations, if we're talking west, because the way Adelaide's designed, I guess you can go north or south, and then if you go east, you're in the hills, and if you go west, you hit the ocean. Now, all the properties along the coast have had similar patterns over the years where some gentrification has come in, the old houses have gone out, and then new builds have come up, and we've seen a completely new demographic come into the area and obviously reshape not just the look of the area, but also the vibrancy and, more importantly, the numbers as well, because the
Mm,
growth is obviously what makes us excited. So Taparu specifically, I like because it's still a coastal suburb. There are properties nearby which are hitting, the seven figures plus.
mm.
And when you can still get into the market for an attainable price for a coastal property, we know that is, there's some value to be made there.
Mm. Absolutely, and I've seen it myself. I've had clients come in getting under a mil for properties in Taparu that are great, already hitting that mil market value, but they're getting them for just under a mil. And as well as the new developments that are happening there, I've seen that they're going to build 200 plus new properties there that are 1.5 mil plus.
Hmm.
So getting into an established Torrens titled property at this kind of in this year really, that's going to be expected to be completed in 6 to 8 months. It's quite, I guess, an opportunity for people. I think people generally overlook the areas they're not sure of. But really, when it comes to the data, when it comes to the numbers, and when it comes to location, that's usually what an agent or someone that has a specialty in that field will isolate for you and really bring forth and kind of run those numbers with you and really give you the insight you need. And I
Well, the
think
numbers never lie, do they?
no, they don't.
So
Move the way.
in terms of talking numbers, one thing to be mindful of is when you're looking at different product types, because you mentioned some Torrance titled homes that we are marketing in Taparu, but regardless of the property type, you're going to find different types of properties and things like that. If you're focused on a particular area, you want to look at what has happened in the neighboring suburbs.
Mm.
So which neighboring suburbs have already had the gentrification? Like what's been newly built? What are the top end price points that market is hitting? So what are the most expensive houses in the area selling for? And then look at what are the most affordable houses selling for. And then it gives you a bit of a grid variance to work out like what is the top end and what is the bottom end. And at that point, you can then decide what price point are you going to be able to get into?
Now, for someone who's new to the industry and doesn't know what a property manager does, can you kind of run them through the process of everything they do and how important they are to them to not just only manage their property, but to mitigate risks that come across the board?
Definitely. A large part of your experience as a property investor is going to come down to the type of property manager that you have. The property manager is going to be responsible for everything that happens to the property after it's been handed to you. So after you get the keys and you give that property manager the key, they are responsible for everything from advertising the property, first of all, well, actually before that. So from the very beginning, from the minute that the property manager gets the key, they're going to produce a condition report for you to tell you what the property was like before anyone ever lived in that. Once they've done the condition report, they generally will go through, take some photos and advertise it on the market to start getting some inquiries for people who want to rent it. Once they get those inquiries, they will then conduct open inspections to meet some of these tenants that are coming through. So once they come through the inspections, they will meet them, they're able to screen them, they can ask them, what are questions they need to, and then they will do the reference checks later to verify, all that information that was given. Once the tenant has been selected, the property manager is then responsible for organizing all the legal documents that will bind you to that tenant. So a lease agreement, which highlights all the roles and responsibilities of both the tenant and the landlord, and they will manage that process for you. The next part after that is then to collect the funds for the rent and the bond. So normally with a property, it's about 4 weeks bond, roughly, and it would be normally 2 weeks rent in advance, and the property manager's job is to manage the rent collection on a weekly, fortnightly, monthly basis, however it's set up. And then obviously with managing the property, they're going to have to deal with all the issues that come up, whether it's a water leak, whether it's a broken handle, the air conditioner's not working, the hot water system's broken, something's flooded, there's water damage coming through. Whatever the issues that will generally arise, from people living in that property, the property manager will handle and they'll deal with. So in many cases, when tenants are calling their property managers to ask for, the little things, these are the things that they are helping you handle without you having to, be on the phone 10 times a week answering questions or doing whatever it is, or having to attend to maintenance requests. So a property manager will play a big role in making sure that the tenancy remains under control, as well as all the rent collection and the funds, and making sure that they are recording all the rents and all the expenses that are coming out. So at the end of the financial year, they can provide you with a statement, which your accountant will use to help you, report your tax position. And all the way through till the time you're ready to sell that property or to move back in. So I guess the property manager's role is really to oversee everything from end to end, and to, I guess, make your life easier whilst being a property owner.
With property managements, with any kind of property, and having tenants, people that don't own the property, move in, they have, I guess, they feel less of a duty of care for your property. How does a property manager kind of, I guess, approach a situation where there's been an issue or something has occurred? How did they make, I guess, the owner's life easy in that sense?
It's first important to understand that the house attracts the tenant. So what I mean by that is, an older house is generally going to appeal to a certain type of tenant, whereas a newer house, which is generally more expensive, is going to appeal to a completely different tenant type, which may be able to afford a higher price point. So understanding that the type of property is going to somewhat dictate the type of tenant that you attract. Now, the property itself, if you know that it has maintenance issues or it needs things to be looked after, you just have to anticipate and be prepared to have to spend the money when it comes up. Because unfortunately with properties, if you don't address an issue early on, it's going to end up growing into a bigger problem, and it becomes a harder problem to solve. So the key is to pinpoint issues early on and address them while they're still small, before letting them grow into bigger problems.
I guess, look, we all have a duty of care when it comes to that kind of with property. The owner has to also look after their own investment and ensure that. But a property manager just seems like it makes your life much easier. And also,
Well, it doesn't make sense to have to take on all the risk and responsibility and all the work for yourself if you are a professional and your time is worth more money doing what you do best.
Exactly right.
If you're a doctor, you're an engineer, you're a professional, you're someone, and your time is worth, say, $100 an hour, why would you go and do a $20 an hour job? And that's the same concept behind property, is that why would you interrupt your life to manage these little things along the way, when for, say, a couple of grand a year, someone's going to manage it, they'll deal with all the headaches, they'll deal with all the problems, and it's their job. They know the laws inside out, and they do this day in, day out. So give it to the professional, let them handle it, and you get on and do more of what you're good at.
Now, when it comes to getting a property manager, most people that are investors, they usually look for property managers, whether they're interstate buyers or here, because they're already in a position where they just don't want to deal with the hassle of everything that involves a property, but they want the reward. Now, I guess that would be where a property manager comes in.
Having a good property manager is going to mean having someone with good communication skills, meaning they're prepared to have the hard conversations and can have those hard conversations when needed. You need them to be organized, because organization is key in property management, especially when you're looking after multiple properties and there's different things at different stages. So you need someone with good organization skills. You need someone who's proactive. So you don't want someone who's reactive, where they wait for the problem to happen before they respond. Sometimes they can spot these issues before they even happen and are able to address them before they even become a problem in the first place. So a proactive property manager makes a big difference in how problems are handled and how they are dealt with. And as you know, when you're dealing with property, you're dealing with people's livelihoods. So in most cases, whenever there's a problem or an issue, emotions are high. So when emotions are high, logic is low. For us as agents, sometimes we can be on the receiving end of someone who's going through a hard time, a challenging period, or whatever it is. So our job is to be able to filter through those emotions, get to the core problem, and find a solution to what needs to be done then and there, make it happen, and then, life goes on. So many people come into this industry thinking that this is going to be an easy ride, especially a lot of agents, a lot of property managers, because from the outside looking in, this industry looks glamorous. It looks like it's, you make a lot of money and you don't do a lot of work. But when you get into the guts of it, it's actually one of the most stressful and the most it's one of the most stressful industries to be in, because there is so much work and so many moving parts. And if you are not organized, if you're not a clear communicator, if you're not a strong character within, if you don't have the right mental capacity to deal with that, unfortunately, a lot of people break. And that's the difference between someone who's approaching this going, okay, I know what I'm up for. I know, and I embrace the hard work that I'm about to sign up for, because by understanding what's ahead is going to prepare you to be able to deal with those challenges along the way.
So Nidal, there's a lot of people in this industry who either own a property or are looking at purchasing a property to subdivide. What kind of advice can you give them, or constraints and timelines and so on and so forth?
Well, we've definitely seen a rise in the amount of people that own properties where they've got a decent amount of land, say 600 meters plus, and they're thinking about developing their property or subdividing, or just as a way to be able to, better their financial situation. In many cases, when we are looking at land for subdivision, we just have to look at what is the highest and best use of that property. So for example, if we're talking about a property that's got an 18-meter frontage, and we know we can get 2 blocks out of that, then what are the 2 best type of properties that we can build on those that's going to achieve the highest amount of return for our investor? So what we would do is we would scope the market. We would look at what are the top end prices that market is achieving. So for example, what is a 4-bedroom brand new house achieving if it's single story? What would it achieve if it was 2-story? What is a 3-bedroom going to cost us? What would a 3-bedroom with a double garage over 2 levels versus 1 level? What is a 4-bedroom over 2 levels over 1 level? And what is the end result? And based on that information, we can then work out, all right, well, if we know what our build cost is going to be, we can then determine which one's going to give us the best return on investment if we are looking at selling those. And then we have people that might want to either sell one and keep one, or maybe they want to keep both and then rent them out and have a passive cash flow type of strategy. So there is no right or wrong way in terms of what someone does with that property afterwards. However, the most important thing is understanding what is the highest and best use of that property after it has been developed or been built up.
What kind of recommendations do you make for people looking at lands to purchase for that intent, to subdivide, live in one and maybe rent out the other, or even sell off one to keep their finances down?
Look, again, we can revisit some of the earlier questions in terms of looking, firstly, what's their capacity, what's their budget, etc. And that gives us an idea of where we can and can't buy. Second thing we look at is what is the zoning policies of those areas. So what can we and can't we build? So what is the highest and best use of that property? So if we're buying that block, can we get 3 properties out of it? Can we get 4? Does it have minimum land size requirements that we need? Can we do road dwellings? Can we do how high can we go? Can we go 2 levels, 3 levels? Because all of those make a big difference to what the end product will be. So again, if you take it back to the original question, what is the highest and best use of that property after we have manufactured whatever we need to into it? You know what I mean? So that's the number one thing. Once you've identified a suburb and an area, then you want to start looking at the little things like, is it flat? Does it have services? Is it on the higher side of the road, the lower side of the road? Are there any stobie poles? Are there any significant trees? Is there any access issues? All of these things will start to be unfolded as you go through the process. But initially, it's always looking at what is the highest and best use of that property and what do we need to do to get it there.
It's almost like reverse engineering the result and then coming back and thinking, well, we've got this build cost and we've got these costs, and then adding it up and seeing if it becomes a feasible way to approach a site.
Correct. And it also comes down on the type of development as well, because some people choose not to build. Some people just do land development only, where they just get a big block of land, they just run some services, put some roads in, and then they sell it for someone else to develop.
Okay.
Some people even just buy a property, they just get the DA approval, just a development approval, and then they on-sell it at a higher price because it's ready to go to site. So there's different types of developments that people can do. And again, that's why it's important to deal with the right professional, ask the right questions, work out what is your capacity, what can you and can't you do. And from that space, that's where you make decisions.
When it comes to contract types in properties, can you guide people through the the simplest ones all the way to the more complex ones that are kind of out of people's understanding?
When it comes to contracts, there's, I guess the property itself is going to determine the type of contract it will need. So for example, if you're buying a house and land package, it generally means there's two contracts in place. One of them is for the land, and then one of them is for the building. And what it generally means is you will have to settle on the land first. So you will get your funds and your loan approved for the total amount, but you settle on the land first. So you owe the money for the land at the beginning. And then as the building continues to progress or gets built, and the builder invoices you and those invoices get paid, then the loan amount starts to increase. And as the loan amount increases, then your prepayments start to increase. But basically what that means is there's two contracts. There's a land contract and a build contract. And then they kind of work simultaneously with each other when it comes to the approval. The other type of contract is what we would refer to as a single contract or just a standard contract. Some people may call it a 1090 in our industry. Basically what it means is you sign a contract that says, I'm going to pay a 5% or a 10% deposit at the beginning, and then I won't pay anything until the property is completed and I'm ready to take possession of it. And that's when I'll pay the remaining 90% balance. Now, the benefit with doing that is that you're not having to pay the holding costs on the property whilst it's getting built. But the downside is you're paying stamp duty on the total value, not only on the land amount. Whereas with a house and land package, you only pay stamp duty on the land portion, not the total value.
With a sale contract, when a property is on market and it goes and someone puts an offer in, what is the process that you would recommend they follow to best help them get to a successful transaction and purchase of the property?
Yeah, it depends on the type of property, again, that they're purchasing. So if they're buying a normal residential property on the open market through a real estate agent, the process that you would go through for that is slightly different from if you're buying a house and land package where you're just putting a nearby. So I guess we'll start with the normal process first, which is you find a property on the market, you want to put an offer in. Generally, you put in your offer with things like your details, what deposit amount you're putting, what finance conditions, what settlement conditions or settlement timelines, and all of that information gets relayed over to a contract. You sign it. Once you've signed the contract and the agents have served you the Form 1, you've generally got 48 hours as a cooling off period. And after that 48 hours, the deposit will be due, which means the 5 or 10% deposit that you've nominated will be paid into the trust accounts, either the conveyances or the agent's trust account, and it sits there until settlement or until the funds get worked out for settlement. That's with a normal standard purchase. If you're buying a house and land package, it works a little bit differently because in many cases you're buying land from a land developer, and in some cases that land may not be registered. So it's not ready to settle on just yet. So it's going to be a sale for a later date. So the nature of the contract is going to be slightly different in the sense that it may be subject to the registration of the title, and the settlement will happen within 2 weeks of those titles being registered. So that's the first part there. When you come to purchase a house and land package, generally speaking, you're only paying an expression of interest deposit, which could be like $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, up to $5,000. That's to secure the property. Mind you, there's no Form 1 served at that stage yet. So you're just signing up for a house and land package. You sign the land contract, you sign a build contract, and then the loan will get approved for the total amounts. And then once your loan is approved, that's when settlement can be booked in, and obviously you go through the normal process. The difference between buying an established property on the open market versus buying a house and land package through a developer or a builder or an agent like ours is going to be slightly different. However, the process that happens after the contract signing is almost the same in terms of the loan approval process, because the loan will then have to get a valuation, and they'll have to do their own checks to make sure that it's unconditionally approved. Once the unconditional approval comes through, that's when the conveyancers and the agents and everyone can book in the settlements. Once you've settled on the property, if it's an established property, you take possession and you live in it and start renting it out. Or if it's a new construction, you own the land, but then you start the building process thereafter.
Can you talk us through the building process and the stages that it usually takes place in?
The building process can be quite complex, and there's multiple stages that will need to be addressed. Initially, it's about getting approval for what can be built. So once we've got the block of land and we've taken into consideration all the design guidelines and the council requirements and what's needed to be built to be approved, at that stage, the first step is booking in a site start date. So this is when you'll see them go on there and they'll scrape the site, they'll line it up with the wire and start digging up the trenches. The second stage is going to be when they start putting in all the plumbing and all the underground services before the concrete gets poured. Once the foundation's poured, the next stage after that would be deemed as the first stage. So normally builders will send their first invoice after the foundation has been poured. So that's a major milestone, because once the slab's down, that means the house can start coming up. The second stage is normally the frame, the roof and frame. And at that stage, they're closing off the house. So they're putting a roof to enable them to be able to work inside. And they're also wrapping it with sarking, which is this material which is like insulation. So it allows the builders to continue working on the house even if they've got rain or any conditions that restrict them. Once that's done and it's been bricked up and they've put the windows and the doors and everything, they deem that as lock-up stage. From there, all the second fix carpentry and the cabinetry and all the fixtures and fittings start coming together inside. And then towards the end of the build, that's when they put in all your, all the appliances and services and things like that to finish it up. So the building phase normally gets broken down over 5 or 6 stages. And what happens is every time the builder completes a stage, they will send you an invoice. Once you sign off on that invoice and you send it to the bank pays the builder, which means your loan amount goes up, which means your repayments go up as well. And this keeps happening until the house is completed. Once the house is fully completed and you've had the keys, you've received the keys, at that stage, you are now responsible for making full payments on the property as would have been advised to you when you signed up for the loan.
So Nidal, when people ask you questions about principal interest and interest only and how it works comparatively, what is better during the build process?
Different lenders will offer different lending products, which will have different features about them. So one of the selling points of some lenders is that they'll only charge you the interest portion of the loan during a construction period. And what that does is it minimizes the repayments that you are making out of pocket, which makes it a little bit more affordable for you to continue building whilst continuing to rent or paying another mortgage or living costs elsewhere. So the idea of what's better, is it principal and interest or interest only? It will depend on whether you're buying this as an owner-occupier or as an investor. And it will also depend on whether you own any other properties that have got debt or not. So for example, if you are an investor and you've got a home loan already, so you've got your own primary place of residence and you've got a mortgage against that house, that debt is not tax deductible against your own home, against where you live. You cannot claim that against tax. Whereas any debt that's associated with an investment property that's producing an income becomes 100% tax deductible. So the idea is, if you can reduce the amount of money that's needed on your investment property, so by going interest only, so then that way the property becomes more likely to be positive cash flow or neutrally cash flow. So if you can interest only on the investment product, but principal and interest on your owner occupier home, that would ideally be a good strategy, that you're using the maximum tax benefits on the investment and you're reducing the amount that you have to pay out of pocket on the investment, but maximizing the pay down period, I guess, on your owner occupier. Also keep in mind that some people opt to go for principal and interest on all it is because part of their strategy is debt reduction as well. If you have the cash flow that'll allow you to, that supports paying principal and interest on your loans, then so be it, because it's another form of forced savings. Whereas if you are limited on the amount of income that you've got coming in and you don't have as much cash flow left over, then no, it makes more sense. Go interest only on your investment, so that way you've got as much cash as you can for your bills, and then any money that you are going to pay over and above the interest, make sure that's going into your owner occupier home, because that's not tax deductible.
So Nidal, can you I guess explore a little bit about off-market property opportunities?
Absolutely. In our business, we often come across many buyers and sellers who, some opt to go to market because they want to keep it, obviously open for everyone. And there are some people that prefer to do business off market. So whether it's for privacy reasons, for financial reasons, whether it's for They don't want people coming through their homes or their properties or whatever it is. Some people prefer to sell off market. Now, in the space that we play in, which is the new construction space and the new development space, a lot of the deals that we do majority of them are off market, because we're dealing with developers who are normally creating a new community or creating a new product that does not exist yet. And for a normal agent to take that property to market, they rely on a property being built and something that they can do an open inspection and walk people through and things like that. Whereas because our business is more focused on numbers and investment returns and more on, I guess, strategy and goals, it's less dependent on the physical property itself. So it gives us the opportunity to be able to sell off the plan or sell off something that hasn't been quite built yet. And the nature of these properties, in most cases, are off market because they're not on realestate.com, they're not on domain.com. You're not going to be able to find them on classified websites. And they are those projects that you see being built in your street where there's no signboard, there's no nothing. And then at the end, you realize that they've already been sold. And I have many people coming to us going, we didn't even get an opportunity to buy this. Well, that's because it was all sold off market before it ever made it to real estate or before it made it to the general public. And I guess the way you would get exposure to some of these opportunities is by working with agencies that specialize in that space or have a network around new developments and new communities. And because our business was specifically focused around brand new house and land packages, new developments, off the plan sales, the network that we had built over the years has been majority new developers and people who are selling stuff that is either off the plan or house and land packages or whatever. And the general nature of those type of properties are off market. So by default, we end up getting opportunities that don't ever make it to market. And for the last 10, 11 years, we've operated completely off market until 2025, where we've just decided to really start taking, some of these residential properties to market because of the rent roll that we've built and obviously the need to have to take them to market now.
So Nidal, you've obviously done this for a while and you have connections interstate with new properties off market sales, as we spoke about earlier. Now, how does someone who is coming into this industry kind of almost blind, doesn't know where to go, how do they have access to someone like you who has all these connections and ability to connect them to these people?
Good question. I guess if you were to look at interstate investing, one of the things to consider at the beginning is looking at the different types of states and who's more investor friendly, because some states are better than others in terms of being an investor. Secondly, how you go about finding professionals is going to be largely dependent on your efforts to try and find someone whose values and whose, I guess, results line up with what you are trying to achieve. So if I'm looking for a broker or an accountant, for example, interstate for a specific thing, I've got a responsibility to make sure that I, go through that process of finding the right one, interviewing them, vetting them, looking at some of the results that they've done, and ultimately going with my gut at some point as well, because you're going to have an element of trust when you're dealing with some people. But as long as you can check off all the main things, like they've got to be professional, they've got to be reputable, they got to be skillful and competent at what they're doing. They've got to have had time in the market as well. So for some experience, reviews always helps, but we know that sometimes they can be made up. But ultimately, it's going to come down to you conversating with that person and you getting a feel. Does this person have the ability and the competency to go out there and achieve the goals that I've discussed with them? And if the answer is yes, then obviously that relationship can continue to proceed. But if you have doubts that this person might be a little bit tardy, doesn't know what they're doing, doesn't have the runs on the board, doesn't really stack up, then trust your gut and look for the next person. So don't go for the flashiest and the loudest and the person who jumps up and down and screams the loudest. Obviously, you got to go for someone who's got the runs on the board and can obviously prove it.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, results, and end of the day, results do matter, right? And especially when it's something so close to home for someone, so personal, they're trying to build a future for their kids, their family. So beyond just results, they have to be able to connect with a person and understand or accept that this person is going to be representing me and my financial property side, and guiding me in that light. So it completely makes sense.
Nicely put.
Mm.